I stood in front of my house with my duffel bag cutting into my shoulder and said, "I'm finally home." The door opened before I knocked. A man I had never seen frowned and said, "Yeah?" I blinked. "Who are you?" He looked me up and down. "Who are you?" I swallowed. "This is my house." He laughed once. "No, it's not." I stepped closer. "My parents live here. Richard and Elaine Carter." He crossed his arms. "They sold it." My chest tightened. "That's not funny." He leaned against the doorframe. "I don't joke about property." I asked, "Where are they?" "Out. They'll be back soon," he said. "You should leave." I said, "I just came back from military duty." He shrugged. "Good for you." I stared at the door, at the walls I painted, at the steps I fixed. I said quietly, "You're standing in my life." He smirked. "Life moves on." A car pulled into the driveway. My mother stepped out first. I said, "Mom?" She froze. My father followed and said, "Daniel?" I asked, "What is this?" My mother whispered, "You're back early." I said, "Who is he?" My father replied, "His name is Mark Reynolds." Mark smiled. "Nice to meet you." I said, "Why is he in my house?" My father said, "Lower your voice." I asked, "Did you sell it?" Silence answered me. My mother said, "We had no choice." I laughed, sharp and broken. "You always had a choice." My father said, "You were gone." I replied, "I was serving." Mark said, "Look man, this doesn't have to be awkward." I turned to him. "You're living my life." He said, "I bought it fair." I asked my parents, "You didn't even call me?" My mother cried. "We thought it was best." I said, "For who?" My father said, "You weren't here to take care of things." I replied, "I trusted you." Mark checked his watch. "I have dinner plans." I clenched my fist. I said, "You replaced me." My father said, "That's not true." I asked, "Then why do I feel erased?" My mother reached out. "Daniel, please." I stepped back. "Don't touch me." Mark said, "You should go." I looked at my parents. "Say something." My father looked away. My mother whispered, "I'm sorry." I nodded slowly. I said, "Keep the house." Mark raised his eyebrows. I added, "Keep everything." I lifted my bag. My father said, "Where will you go?" I answered, "Anywhere that still wants me." My mother sobbed. I walked past them without looking back. Behind me the door closed. I stood on the street and said to myself, I have nowhere to go. I came back the next morning and said, "We need to talk." My father didn't look surprised. "We already talked." I said, "No, you explained." "You didn't answer." My mother sat at the table and whispered, "Daniel, please don't shout." I replied, "I'm not shouting. I'm breaking." My father said, "You're being dramatic." I laughed. "You gave my house to another man." He answered, "We sold it." I asked, "While I was gone?" My mother said, "We needed money." I asked, "For what?" She looked down. My father said, "Bills? Repairs? Life?" I said, "I sent you my pay." He replied, "It wasn't enough." That hurt more than the door closing yesterday. I asked, "So you chose him?" My father said, "We chose stability." I said, "You chose convenience." My mother cried. "We thought you'd understand." I answered, "You didn't even ask." My father leaned back. "You were unreachable." I said, "I called every week." Silence filled the room. My mother whispered, "We didn't want to worry you." I replied, "You erased me instead." I remembered standing in this same kitchen years ago saying, "I'll do whatever you need." My father had said, "You're a good son." I remembered canceling plans, skipping dreams, saying yes every time. I looked at him now and said, "Was I ever enough?" He avoided my eyes. My mother sobbed harder. I said, "Say it." My father said, "This isn't about love." I nodded. "That's the problem." Emily stood in the doorway. She said, "Daniel?" My father snapped, "Stay out of this." Emily froze. I said, "You knew?" She whispered, "I tried." My mother cried, "Don't put this on her." I said, "Someone should carry it." My father said, "Mark helped us when you weren't here." I asked, "So I had to disappear to be replaced?" He replied, "Don't twist it." I said, "You defended him faster than me." My mother said, "He's not the enemy." I answered, "Then why do I feel like one?" I stood up. My hands were shaking. I said, "I gave you everything." My father replied, "And we gave you life." That sentence broke something inside me. I said quietly, "You used it." My mother reached for me. I stepped back. Emily cried, "I'm sorry." I nodded. "I know." I looked at my parents and said, "You lost me yesterday." My father said, "Don't be foolish." I replied, "I learned from you." I walked out. No one followed. I dropped my bag on the motel floor and said, "This is where I end up." The room smelled old. The bed creaked when I sat. I pulled cash from my pocket and counted it. 2 weeks, I muttered. Maybe less. My phone buzzed. Liam's name lit the screen. I answered and said, "Yeah." He said, "You sound dead." I replied, "I feel worse." He asked, "Where are you?" I said, "Cheap motel near the highway." He paused. "What happened?" I laughed. "My parents sold my house." He said, "Say that again." I repeated it. He swore. "I'm coming." I lay back and stared at the ceiling. I said to myself, "You survived war but lost home." I heard laughter outside. Someone said, "Mark's a good guy." Another voice said, "Yeah, lucky family." My jaw tightened. There was a knock. I opened the door. Liam stood there and said, "You look like hell." I stepped aside. "Welcome to it." He dropped his bag. "Talk." I said, "They chose him." He asked, "Who?" I replied, "A stranger with money." He said, "And you?" I shrugged. "Disposable." He sat and said, "You're not weak." I said, "I feel useless." He leaned forward. "You saved my life." I replied, "Didn't save mine." He said, "This isn't the end." I laughed. "Feels like it." I told him, "I followed rules." He said, "You followed honor." I said, "It got me nothing." He replied, "It got you here." I asked, "Here where?" He said, "Alive." I rubbed my face. I said, "I don't belong anywhere." He answered, "You belong to yourself." I stayed quiet. We went out to eat. At the counter, someone said, "Mark fixed the old house fast." Another said, "Smart man." I stared at my plate. Liam noticed. He whispered, "Don't react." I nodded. Outside, I said, "I want to break something." He replied, "Then build something instead." I asked, "How?" He said, "One step." Back in the room, he tossed me a beer. I said, "I hate this feeling." He said, "Good." I frowned. He added, "Means you still care." I asked, "What if I stay angry?" He said, "Then aim it." I said, "I don't want revenge." He answered, "Then want respect." I lay down. He said, "Sleep." I said, "What if I can't?" He replied, "I'll be here." The lights buzzed. I whispered, "They never needed me." He said, "You needed you." I closed my eyes. I felt small. I felt angry. I felt alive. I stood across the street and said to myself, "That used to be my life." Mark laughed on the porch like he owned the sound. My father stood beside him and nodded at everything he said. My mother smiled the way she used to smile at me. I said quietly, "So this is how I disappear." Mark raised his voice and said, "Some people don't come back strong." I knew he meant me. A neighbor laughed. I clenched my jaw. I remembered my father saying, "Pride doesn't feed a family." I remembered answering, "I'll figure it out." Now Mark was figuring it out for them. Mr. Harris shuffled toward me and said, "Daniel?" I looked at him. "You remember me?" He nodded. "Hard to forget a good kid." I asked, "How long has he been here?" He replied, "Too short to feel right." I said, "Does it look right?" He sighed. "Looks rushed." Mark stepped inside and shouted, "Drinks are on me." I said, "He buys loyalty." Mr. Harris said, "He bought silence." I watched Mark gesture like a hero. I thought, he wears my place like a costume. I said, "He didn't earn any of it." Mr. Harris replied, "Neither did your parents." I asked, "Do people believe him?" He said, "People believe comfort." I nodded. Later, Mark walked out and said, "Some men leave and don't come back." He looked straight at me. I didn't answer. He smirked and added, "Weak men run." Mr. Harris whispered, "Ignore him." I said, "I won't forget him." We sat on his porch. He said, "The sale papers were strange." I asked, "Strange how?" He replied, "Fast. Too fast." My pulse shifted. I asked, "Legal?" He said, "Maybe not clean." I leaned forward. I said, "They rushed it." He nodded. Like they feared something. I said, they feared me coming back. Mark's laughter echoed. I thought he thinks he won. I said, he's loud. Mr. Harris said, loud men hide cracks. I watched my father clap Mark's shoulder. I whispered, that was my spot. Mr. Harris replied, still is in law maybe. That sentence stayed with me. I repeated it inside. In law maybe. Mark looked at his phone and said, business is good. I thought about my empty wallet. I didn't feel small. I felt alert. I said, I won't fight him with fists. Mr. Harris smiled faintly. Smart. I added, I'll let him talk. He said, men like him always do. I stood up. Mark saw me and laughed again. I met his eyes. I said nothing. Inside something shifted. Anger stayed but it cooled. I felt focus replace noise. Mr. Harris said, you planning something? I answered, I'm planning patience. He nodded slowly. I walked away. For the first time since I returned, I felt taller. I sat across from Sophia Miller and said, I don't want drama. She nodded. Then you want control. I asked, do I have any? She slid a folder toward me. More than you think. I opened it and said, they sold it fast. She replied, too fast. I asked, illegal? She said, careless. I leaned back. Careless ruined my life. She answered, careless can be undone. I said, I don't want to hurt them. She asked, do you want justice? I hesitated. She waited. I said, I want my name back. She smiled. That's reasonable. She pointed at a page. No proper notice. I said, they never told me. She added, no verified consent. I laughed once. Sounds familiar. She said, Mark rushed them. I replied, he rushed my parents. She corrected me. Your parents let him. My phone rang. I looked at the screen and said, it's them. Sophia said, answer or don't. I answered, hello. My mother said, Daniel, please move on. I said, from what? My father said, from this anger. I replied, you mistake silence for anger. My mother cried. We did what we had to. I said, so did I. My father said, don't make this worse. I asked, worse for who? Silence. Sophia watched me closely. I said into the phone, I won't beg. My father snapped, don't threaten us. I replied, I'm done explaining myself. My mother whispered, we're still your parents. I answered, then act like it. I hung up. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Sophia said, that was your line. I asked, what line? She replied, the one where you stop shrinking. I stood and paced. I said, part of me wants to burn it all down. She said, that part is loud but short-lived. I asked, what about the quiet part? She said, the quiet part wins. I stopped walking. I said, I won't chase them. She nodded. I added, I won't fight Mark directly. She smiled. I finished, I'll let the truth walk on its own. She closed the folder. She said, patience exposes lies. I asked, and me? She replied, it rebuilds you. I thought about the door closing. I thought about Mark's laugh. I felt neither rush nor fear. Sophia said, are you ready? I said, not for revenge. She asked, for what then? I answered, for balance. She stood and offered her hand. I shook it. I said, do nothing fast. She replied, exactly. Outside the air felt lighter. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I said to myself, I'll stay quiet. The silence felt powerful. I stood outside the cafe and heard someone say, Mark Reynolds missed a payment. Another voice replied, that's not like him. I kept walking and said nothing. Later my phone buzzed. Liam said, you hear the noise? I asked, what noise? He replied, business noise. His kind. I said, I'm not involved. Liam laughed. Exactly. I passed my old house and saw Mark arguing on the phone. He said, give me time. I thought time doesn't wait for liars. My mother called that night. She said, Daniel, are you okay? I answered, I'm fine. She asked, have you heard things? I replied, I hear everything. She whispered, Mark is under pressure. I said, you chose pressure. She cried. My father took the phone. He said, this situation is temporary. I asked, like me? He said, don't start. I replied, you already did. He hung up. The next day, I saw Nathan Cole step out of Mark's office. Nathan said loudly, "Deadlines matter." Mark followed him and said, "I said I'll fix it." Nathan replied, "You said that last week." I stood across the street and watched. Mr. Harris saw me and said, "Walls crack quietly." I nodded. He added, "You didn't touch a thing." I said, "I didn't need to." Emily texted me. She wrote, "Can we talk?" I answered, "Where?" She met me at the park and said, "I'm sorry." I asked, "For what?" She replied, "For being scared." I said, "I don't blame you." She cried. I told them not to rush. I said, "They rushed anyway." She nodded. "They didn't listen." She looked at me and said, "You look different." I asked, "How?" She said, "Calm." I answered, "I learned." She said, "They're worried." I replied, "They taught me worry is weakness." She wiped her eyes. She said, "Mark yells now." I said, "He always did." We sat in silence. I didn't feel heavy. That evening Mark confronted me outside a store. He said, "Enjoying the show?" I asked, "What show?" He scoffed. "You think this is karma?" I replied, "I think this is math." He frowned. He stepped closer. He said, "You planned this." I answered, "I planned my exit." He laughed nervously. He said, "You're nothing." I replied, "Then why are you shaking?" He walked away. I stayed still. My father called again. He said, "Things are complicated." I asked, "Were they simple when you chose him?" He said, "We're under stress." I replied, "So was I." He lowered his voice. He said, "Mark may lose the house." I answered, "That's between you and him." He said, "You're being cold." I replied, "I'm being fair." When the call ended, I felt steady. Not proud. Prepared. Liam met me later and said, "You okay?" I answered, "I'm ready." He smiled. "For what?" I said, "Whatever comes." I walked past my old street one last time that night. Lights flickered inside the house. Arguments leaked through walls. I didn't feel weak anymore. I felt inevitable. Mark shouted my name in the middle of the street and said, "You planned this." People stopped walking. I turned and said, "Planned what?" He pointed at me. "My downfall." I replied, "You did that yourself." My father rushed over and said, "What's happening?" Mark said, "Ask your son." I said calmly, "I didn't touch anything." Mark laughed. "You're lying." I asked, "Where's your proof?" Sophia stepped beside me and said, "I have documents." Mark froze. She continued, "The sale was rushed." My mother whispered, "What does that mean?" Sophia said, "It means it's invalid." Mark snapped, "You can't do this." Sophia replied, "I already did." I watched my father's face change. He said, "Daniel?" I answered, "You didn't listen before." Mark said, "You wanted revenge." I replied, "I wanted truth." Sophia handed papers to the official standing nearby. The man nodded. My mother cried, "Please stop." I said, "I never started." Mark shouted, "This is humiliation." I looked at him and said, "Now you understand." My father's voice shook. He said, "We didn't know." I replied, "You didn't ask." My mother collapsed against him. Mark said, "You think you won?" I answered, "I think I'm free." The official said, "The property returns to its original owner." Mark stepped back. People whispered. Mark stared at me and said, "You're empty." I replied, "I survived you." He turned away. My father said softly, "I was wrong." I looked at him. I said, "Too late." Sophia touched my arm. She said, "It's done." I nodded. My mother cried my name. I didn't answer. The crowd faded. The street felt quiet. I didn't smile. I didn't feel joy. I felt light. I met them in the living room and said, "Say what you came to say." My father cleared his throat. I was wrong. I nodded. He said, "I chose safety over you." I replied, "You chose yourself." My mother cried. "We were afraid." I answered, "So was I." My father said, "I regret it every day." I asked, "Then why did you defend him?" He looked down. "Because admitting truth scared me." My mother said, "Please forgive us." I said, "I'm listening." Silence pressed on my chest. Emily stood near the door. She whispered, "I missed you." I said, "I know." My mother reached for my hand. I let her hold it. She said, "I failed you." I replied, "You did." She flinched. I added, and I survived. My father said, "What can we do now?" I answered, "Nothing." He frowned. I said, "This isn't revenge." My mother asked, "Then what is it?" I replied, "Distance." My father said, "We raised you." I answered, "You raised me to endure." He said, "We loved you." I replied, "Love doesn't abandon." My mother sobbed. I stayed still. Emily stepped forward and hugged me. She said, "I never stopped caring." I hugged her back. I said, "Don't lose yourself like I did." My parents watched us. My father said, "Will you stay tonight?" I answered, "No." My mother whispered, "Please?" I replied, "I can't heal here." I walked through the house alone. I touched the wall and remembered painting it. I said quietly, "It doesn't hurt like before." The rooms felt smaller. The memories felt lighter. My father stood behind me and said, "I'm proud of you." I replied, "That came late." He nodded. At the door my mother said, "We love you." I paused. I said, "I believe you." I opened the door. Outside, Emily squeezed my arm. She said, "Come back someday." I answered, "We'll see." I walked away without looking back. The past stayed inside the house. It didn't follow me anymore. I unpacked the last box in my new apartment and said, "This is mine." The walls were bare. The air smelled clean. I dropped onto the couch. Liam called. I answered, "Hey." He said, "Settled in?" I replied, "Starting." He laughed. "That sounds like you." I said, "I'm learning." I walked to the window and said quietly, "I lost a lot." Liam asked, "Do you regret it?" I answered, "Some things yes, some things no." He said, "Good." I cooked dinner and muttered, "I have to feed myself, not anyone else." The apartment felt small but honest. I said, "I chose this." Emily texted me, "How's the new place?" I replied, "Safe." She answered, "Glad you're okay." I typed, "I am." I reflected. I said aloud, "I lost a house but I gained myself." I smiled faintly. I whispered, "I can't control them. I can control me." A neighbor waved. I waved back and said, "Hello." She smiled. I paid bills online. I said, "Every dollar earned is mine." No one could touch it. No one could touch me. I went for a run. I felt my legs push me forward. I said, "I'm moving, not fleeing." At the park I watched couples laugh. I muttered, "I don't need their approval." I felt calm. Back home I wrote in my journal. I said, "I survived betrayal, lies, and empty promises. I survived myself." The pen paused. I whispered, "Karma whispered too." Quietly, perfectly. I closed the journal. I said aloud, "I am enough." No one answered. No one needed to. I sat by the window and watched the city lights. I said softly, "I am free." I poured a cup of coffee. I muttered, "I built my life somewhere else. Stronger, calmer, steady." I touched the walls. I said, "This is mine." Finally. I leaned back. I whispered, "I don't need to prove anything. Not to them. Not to him. Not to anyone." I closed my eyes. I said, "I am done chasing approval. I am done shrinking." I felt the weight lift. I felt peace. I smiled faintly and said, "I am enough. I am home."